Hello and welcome to today's painting demonstration of a snake plant houseplant. I'm using a few different colors today: titanium white, cadmium yellow medium hue, quinacridone nickel azo gold, alizarin crimson hue, phthalo blue red shade, and hooker's green hue. I'm using artist quality paints today, but if you're using student quality paints, this should still work pretty well. So I'm starting off my painting by just using a fairly narrow brush. I'm using an angle shader to just draw in the shapes of what I'm painting today. This is just an outline at this stage. It doesn't have to be perfect. You can adjust as you go along at later stages. You'll also notice that this canvas panel is pre-painted with a colored ground. A colored ground is just a solid color that you pre-paint your canvas panel. It doesn't necessarily matter what color you use, but it's very popular to use different tones of grays or browns as your colored ground. And a colored ground gives you a couple of advantages. One, it can take away the intimidation factor of painting onto a bright white canvas panel. Some people can feel psychologically it's just easier to get started painting if they're not painting onto white. So that's one of the advantages. The other advantage is you'll notice later on that you don't necessarily have to completely cover the colored ground when you're painting. You can leave a little bit of it poking through. It provides unity for your whole painting because you can see little bits of it everywhere. And you also don't feel like you need to really fill in all the every tiny little bit of the ground showing through, which is particularly helpful when you compare it to white, because when little bits of white show through, that can just be really distracting and look like an unfinished painting, but little bits of colored ground showing through can look really, really nice. So now I've moved on to the leaves. I started by painting one of the leaves a bit of a brighter green, so I took some of the hooker's green hue and some of the cadmium yellow, and I painted the bright one in first, and now I've added some more hooker's green to that mix to make some of the darker leaves. Now for this stage of the painting, it doesn't hugely matter what kind of paintbrush that you use. I'm using a fairly narrow angle shader to draw in my lines. It allows me to do fairly thin lines. If you use a brush that's fatter or a round or a larger brush, your initial blocking or your initial drawing will have wider lines. And that doesn't necessarily matter in the long run, because with acrylic you could always just paint over in places where maybe you put a line too wide. And now I'm just drawing in the edge between where my background will go and the table. So I'm ready to start blocking in some actual color and shapes. I want to start with doing the darkest parts of the leaves, so I've taken my mix of hooker's green and yellow and added quite a bit of hooker's green to it, and I'm just putting in the darkest colors where the shadow of the leaves would be, as well as just the actual dark parts of the leaves. Now I'm adding in some of the lighter tones to the painting. So I'm adding in just a little bit of an edge where it's not quite as dark as the previous color that I was putting in. And now I'm adding some light to this front leaf. Now at this point, I'm not putting a whole lot of detail in. I'm really just blocking in the colors. I'm trying not to have too much of a dividing line in between this on this front leaf, because half of it is dark and half of it is light. I'm making sure that there's a little bit of a softness to the transition to show that it's one leaf and it's one form that is curving. Now I'm starting to add a little bit of detail into these leaves. I don't want to add too much, but I do want to show that this is a snake plant. So I'm adding a little bit of the stripes to the leaves. So in the areas where the leaves are lighter, I'm adding a bit of a darker color. And then in the areas that are a bit darker, I'm adding a little bit of a lighter color. Now I want to paint that little leaf that's in the background, and in the photo it's a little bit bluer than the others, so I want to make this one a little bit bluer as well. So I've taken the mix that I've been using of Hooker's Green and the Cadmium Yellow. I'm adding a little bit of the Phthalo Blue. Not too much, I still want it to be green, but I do want to have it be a little bit bluer than the rest. Now I'm taking a little bit of that same color and I'm adding it to some of the other leaves. The issue that can happen if you paint one leaf a little different shade than the others is it doesn't unify with the rest of the plant. So you want to make sure you have a little bit of the different colors that are being used throughout the leaves. You want to make sure that they're throughout all of the leaves or most of the leaves. And as I paint in some of the stripe details, I move my paintbrush in different ways so that I'm not repeating exactly the same paintbrush stroke throughout the whole painting. Because if you do that, it starts looking like you're almost stamping your paintbrush just everywhere, and it just looks like you've it just looks like repetition. So if for some of the stripes you have your paintbrush a little bit horizontal, other areas you hold your paintbrush a little bit vertical, you just use the corner of your flat brush, things like that. That can really add a bit of a level of realism. Even though this is not a realistic painting, it can add a little bit of that level of realism to really unify your painting. Now the edge of snake plant leaves often have a yellow edge to them. So I've taken some of my cadmium yellow medium hue, and I've added a little bit of a warm color. You can use whatever red you want. You can use the alizarin crimson, Quin Nicolazo gold, or whatever red or warm color you're using. Add just a little bit to the yellow to warm it up. And I'm just adding it into that back leaf right now. Sometimes it can be a little tricky if you want to be precise with your painting. So you can kind of see on the edge of the video that I'm holding my one wrist with my hand. That just allows me to have a little bit of extra precision. I do go back and forth between doing that and not doing that. I don't want to be too precise with this painting. I want it to have a loose feel and just have a really nice energy to it. I don't want to look like I was really, really tensed up when I was painting. With the spot that I'm painting right now, one of the nice things when painting is to have a really bright spot and a really dark spot together. So that edge of yellow on the leaf up against the shadowed area, that can look really nice. And on this back painting, I've used a bit of a cooler yellow for the edge of the leaf. And now I'm just going to spend a few minutes just adding some darker areas, some lighter areas, just so I feel like every leaf has the form that I want it to have, and anywhere that I want to add a little bit of extra, a little bit of detail, anything like that. Now I've taken some of the yellow and a little bit of the Quin Nicolazo gold because some of the yellow edging is quite warm. So I just wanted to warm it up a little bit more. Again, if you're not using Quin Nicolazo gold, you can use whatever version of like the orangey brown that you're using or the red that you're using. Yellow can be a pretty translucent color with acrylic paint, so sometimes it can take 2 or 3 layers before you're happy with your yellows. Now I'm pretty happy with the leaves, so now I'm going to move on to painting the plant pot. I've taken some alizarin crimson hue, mixed it in with the quinacridone Nicolazo gold so I can get a nice terracotta color, and I'm just blocking it in. Depending what paint colors you're using and what brands, you might be able to get away with painting the paint pot in one go, but because the quinacridone colors tend to be very, very translucent, it'll take me a couple of layers to get it to where I want it to be. So I'm just blocking it in as one solid color at this point. Now that the plant pot is dry, I've moved on to mixing the color for the table. I wanted to do a pear green, so I took some of the yellow, I took a tiny bit of the phthalo blue, a lot of the white. I think I added a little bit of the alizarin crimson hue. I just played around with it until I was happy with the color, and now I'm just blocking in the color of the table. Now I've cleaned off my paintbrush again and I'm moving back to the plant pot. I've taken the color that I had mixed previously and added a fair amount of white to it. So the light is coming from the right side of this plant, so I'm adding quite a bit of light color to that side. Cleaned off my paintbrush again, and now I'm moving over to the dark side of the plant pot. I've taken my Quin Nicolazo gold and alizarin crimson hue mix, and I've added a little bit of Hooker's green hue. Now, green is on the opposite side of the color wheel from red, so it really makes a nice shadow color when you mix those two colors together. Now I want to start repainting the middle of the plant pot where the color isn't really bright and it also isn't in shadow. So I've taken my main mix, the Quin Nicolasa Gold and Alizarin Crimson Hue, and mixed those together and just adding another layer of that mix to the middle of the plant pot. And I will just start playing around with blending to transition from the dark to the light. And you can play around with that as much or as little as you want. I don't want it to be too stripy, so I'm going to spend a few minutes just working on the transition. You can spend quite a bit of time if you want it to have a really, really smooth transition, but I find it can sometimes be nice if you leave a little bit of your paintbrush and paint strokes in there. And I'm just adding some quite bright version of the mix to just show where the brightest part of the light or where the light is glinting off the most. So that allows you to show the edge of the plant pot, and it allows you to show a little bit of the curve and the form as well. Now I'm pretty happy with the color of the pot, but I do want to add just the tiniest little bit of a shadow directly underneath the pot. So I'm taking 3 colors that are on the opposite side of the color wheel from each other. So a bit of the red, bit of the yellow, bit of the blue, and mixing those together until I have quite a dark color. And then I'm taking a narrow brush this time because I really just want a very, very thin shadow right underneath the pot. And I'm just doing a single line underneath, curving around. Now you'll notice I went a little bit too far in one spot and I drew the shadow as a line that's kind of sticking out into the table. The advantage with acrylics is you can affix little mistakes like that. So I take my wider paintbrush that I was using earlier and I can just cover it right up. Now I'm going to spend a few more minutes just adding a little bit of interest to the table so it's not just one single color. I've added a bit of the phthalo blue to my mix and I'm just going to put it on the side of the table where it would be darker. I don't want to add a full shadow, I just want to add a little bit of darkness where the light wouldn't be quite as intense. And I'm going to continue playing around with the color on the table, and I've added a bit more white to my mix and am putting it down where the light would be stronger on the table, so on the right hand side. And I'm just going to play around with that until I'm happy. Now we can move on to the background. I've taken some phthalo blue and white, and I'm just going to start blocking in that background. I flipped around my canvas panel because I want to make sure that I have enough control with my paintbrush as I go around these leaves. I don't want to accidentally just slip and take out one of the leaves that we worked so hard on. And I'm just going to work on blocking it in. As I continue to paint the background, I'm just going to point out the advantage that I had mentioned earlier of using a colored ground. I'm not fully making sure that the blue of the background completely covers the background. It'll mostly cover it, but you can see little hints of that ground peeking through, and that can look really, really nice. It allows you to not be too painstaking with your painting of solid colors or semi-solid colors. And it really adds a little bit of unity to your painting because there can be a little bit of that peeking through the background, the table, the plant itself. You might notice that the part that I'm painting in the background right now is a little bit lighter than the rest. That's because I mixed a little bit more color and it was just a little bit lighter, and that's absolutely fine, and I think it's actually a benefit. I don't necessarily want to have the entire background be exactly the same shade. Adding a little bit of paint that's a little bit of a different color. Sometimes it can have a little bit more of the green in it. Sometimes it can be a little bit bluer, a little bit darker, a little bit lighter. That just adds some variety to the painting itself. And now I'm just going to play around with the background until I'm happy with how it looks. And to finish off the painting, I've just taken my really, really tiny brush and I'm painting in my signature. And that's it, you have your painting.